The fluorescent lights of Sacred Heart Hospital in Denver hummed their endless mechanical prayer, the same prayer they'd hummed for 30 years, indifferent to the lives that moved beneath them. Rachel Torres walked through the third-floor corridor with the kind of precision that most people mistook for timidity, her scrubs crisp, her movements efficient, her presence the sort that made you forget she'd been there at all once she left the room. She had learned this skill in Marjah, learned it in a forward operating base where being noticed meant being remembered, and being remembered meant someone would come looking for you when the war ended and you were supposed to stay buried under a civilian name and a temp agency contract that asked no questions about gaps in employment or why a 42-year-old woman with calloused hands wanted to push supply carts instead of lead teams. Her badge clipped to her waistband read, R. Torres, temporary staff, the R standing for Rachel instead of the name her mother had given her, the name that still appeared in classified databases in Arlington. She kept her head down as she moved through the halls, acknowledging other staff with the smallest nods, apologizing when she had to squeeze past anyone, her voice soft as still water. "Excuse me, doctor. Sorry, coming through. Thank you for waiting." The words came out rehearsed because they were rehearsed, because every interaction had been practiced in the mirror of her efficiency apartment until the grateful, deferential tone became automatic, became armor. She'd been at Sacred Heart for 19 days. Not that anyone was counting. Well, someone was counting. Someone was always counting. The staff lounge smelled like stale coffee and industrial cleanser, a combination that triggered something ancient in her nervous system, not quite a memory, but the ghost of one, the way certain smells could transport you backward without your permission. This morning, the blood drive had set up near the windows, a mobile unit with a banner that read "Help Save Lives, Donate Today," and the phlebotomist, a young woman with kind eyes and exhausted shoulders, was sitting behind the table looking at her clipboard like it contained bad news. Rachel approached without being asked. That was her way. She didn't volunteer for things loudly or enthusiastically. She simply appeared where she was needed and did the work. "Oh, negative?" the phlebotomist asked, glancing up. "Yes," Rachel said. "We're critically short. Trauma season starts early this year." The phlebotomist gestured to the chair. "You're a lifesaver." Rachel didn't smile. She sat down, rolled up her sleeve, and watched the needle go in with the detached interest of someone who had performed this procedure on herself in field conditions with nothing but adrenaline and a prayer. The vein rolled slightly, then steadied. Professional. The phlebotomist's technique was solid, 90-degree angle, smooth insertion, no fishing around. Competent hands. Rachel respected competent hands. 15 minutes later, she walked back to the supply room with a bandage on her arm and the quiet knowledge that her blood might save someone's life tonight, tomorrow, next week. It was the kind of small grace that didn't require recognition or paperwork or anyone knowing her real name. The kind of grace that sustained her when everything else felt like a lie. The supply cart needed restocking. Saline bags, gauze pads, trauma shears, the endless catalogue of things that kept people alive in 30-second increments. She worked methodically, her hands moving with a kind of muscle memory that no amount of hiding could suppress. Every motion efficient. Every placement logical. 1,000 shifts in forward operating bases had taught her that the difference between life and death was often just the 3-second lag time it took to find the right instrument, and she would never, not once, not ever, be responsible for 3 seconds of delay. She was reaching for the next box of supplies when Dr. Marcus Hargrove walked past the nurse's station, his white coat perfectly pressed, his stethoscope draped like a medal across his shoulders. He was the kind of man who moved through hospitals the way emperors moved through capitals, with the assured knowledge that everything was arranged specifically for his benefit. His reputation preceded him like a police escort. Top trauma surgeon. Published researcher. Donor favorite. The sort of doctor who appeared in hospital fundraising videos and had his name on an endowment plaque somewhere in administration. He didn't see Rachel. That was the point. She was designed to be unseen. But his voice carried through the corridors with the kind of projection that demanded an audience, and she heard him through the supply room doorway, heard him the way you hear distant thunder, as a warning. "Gentlemen," he was saying, his tone pitched for performance, "I've got money on the temp in supply. She quits within a week. Anyone want action on that? Someone laughed. A nurse she recognized, a resident she'd held the door for yesterday. What makes you so confident? Someone asked. Because, Hargrove said, and his voice was the voice of someone who had never been wrong about anything in his life. People like that don't last. They get here thinking they want to help, thinking they're going to change the world, and then they realize how much work it actually is. How little respect they get. How disposable they are. By day 7, they're gone. I've seen it 100 times. Rachel continued placing supplies in the cart. Saline bags in the left column. Gauze in the center. Trauma shears on the right side, handles out. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench. She was breathing at the same depth, the same rhythm, as if she'd heard nothing at all. This was the skill that had saved her life in Marjah, the ability to absorb abuse like sand absorbs water, to let it pass through her without leaving a stain. She had been called worse things by better men in places where the consequences for flinching were measured in body bags. The supply cart was full. She rolled it back to the corridor, moving with the same precision as always, and continued her rounds. Room 312 needed restocking. Room 314. The medication closet on the 3rd floor. The work was endless and simple and exactly what she needed, the kind of work that asked nothing except that she show up and be competent and never, ever draw attention to herself. That night, in the small silence of her efficiency apartment on Colfax Avenue, Rachel sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and reached for the closet. The closet was small, organized, impersonal. 13 sets of scrubs, all the same color. 3 pairs of civilian pants. 2 sweaters. A jacket she never wore. Underneath everything, in the back corner where the light didn't quite reach, a pair of boots. She pulled them out carefully, as if they might break or vanish. They were old. The leather was cracked in places, stained with the particular color of dust that only exists in Helmand Province, in the compounds and valleys where the light comes down like judgment. The laces were frayed at the edges, worn soft from thousands of times being unlaced and relaced, tied and retied in the dark, in the rain, in the pre-dawn hours before a patrol. She ran her thumb over the toe box where the leather had been scuffed to near transparency from climbing over walls, from dropping into compounds, from moving through villages where every step had to be silent and every gesture had to communicate that you were there to help, not harm, even when the people watching your approach couldn't decide if you were savior or invader. The trembling started in her hands. Just a small thing. Just the autonomic memory of what these boots had carried her through. Marjah. Sanjan Valley. The schoolhouse compound where the IED had taken out Martinez and Chen. The village where they'd found the children in the basement of the Taliban stronghold, malnourished and terrified, and she'd held them while the corpsmen established triage and classified the wounds as survivable, as fixable, as the kind of damage that modern medicine could heal if they moved fast enough and the bird was in range. She wrapped the boots back in an old t-shirt, one that still had a faint scent of desert detergent, long faded, and buried them beneath the folded scrubs. Then she closed the closet door and sat in the darkness of her apartment and listened to the traffic on Colfax Avenue outside her window, the sound of people who had never seen what she'd seen, people for whom Thursday night was just Thursday night and not the anniversary of anything that mattered. The next morning, Rachel arrived at Sacred Heart at 6:58, 2 minutes before her 7 o'clock shift, just as always. She clocked in without incident. She changed into her scrubs. She collected her assignment board and began her rounds with the same methodical efficiency that had characterized every shift since she'd started. Dr. Marcus Hargrove was already in the hospital, already moving through the corridors with the fluid confidence of someone who had never experienced a consequence in his life. He didn't acknowledge her as she passed. She didn't expect him to. She was the supply nurse, the temp, the disposable fixture that made the machinery run. She was beneath his notice and above his concern, and that was exactly how she needed it. But something had changed in his eye since yesterday, she noticed. Something had shifted. He was looking at her differently now, the way a man looks at something he's betting against, something he's already decided will fail. It was the look of someone who had the full weight of institutional authority behind him, who understood exactly how little she could do to protect herself, who had not yet met a person he couldn't break. He would learn differently. But not yet. For now, she had work to do. Supplies to stock. Lives that depended on the 3-second advantage of knowing exactly where everything was. For now, she was still just a temp nurse in Denver, and her past was just a pair of boots wrapped in an old t-shirt, hidden in a closet where no one would ever think to look. For now, that was enough. The cafeteria at Sacred Heart smelled like industrial bleach and overheated chicken broth. Rachel sat alone at a corner table, her tray positioned strategically where she could see the main entrance without appearing to watch anything at all. The soup was lukewarm. The crackers were stale. Neither mattered. What mattered was remaining invisible, and invisibility required consistency, same table, same time, same careful posture that suggested she took up as little space as possible. She was halfway through the bowl when the shadow fell across her lunch. Dr. Hargrove didn't slow his pace. He simply adjusted his trajectory by 6 inches, and his hip connected with the edge of her tray like a ship's prow cutting through water. The bowl launched upward in a perfect arc. For one suspended moment, Rachel watched the soup separate into individual droplets, each one catching the fluorescent light like tiny copper coins. Then gravity reasserted itself. The ceramic shattered against the tile floor with a sound like breaking teeth, and the broth spread across her scrubs in a warm, spreading map. 24 people stopped eating. The room went absolutely silent except for the distant hiss of the soda machine in the corner. Hargrove didn't break stride. His voice carried back over his shoulder as he walked toward the exit, casual as a man commenting on the weather. Careful, mouse, hospitals can be dangerous places. Rachel's jaw tightened. A single tear formed at the corner of her left eye, not from sadness, but from the precise pressure of restraint, the same phenomenon that made military personnel weep under extreme G-force. She watched it roll down her cheek without wiping it away, then slowly set down her fork. The tray was still rolling slightly, sending out smaller tremors of broth across the tile. She could feel the weight of 24 pairs of eyes on her back, the texture of their stares like sandpaper against her skin. She knelt in the spreading puddle. Each piece of ceramic took on its own significance as she picked it up, sharp edges, still warm from the soup. Her hands moved with the kind of methodical precision that comes from experience with worse. Marjah had taught her that humiliation and physical pain were just information. They were data points. They could be catalogued and filed away in the same mental repository where she stored blast patterns and blood types and the names of the men who didn't make it home. The silence in the cafeteria became a living thing. She could hear her own breathing. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed at exactly 60 Hz, a frequency that never changed, never deviated. When she stood, carrying the broken pieces in her cupped palms, she made direct eye contact with a surgical resident who quickly looked away. By 2 o'clock, the humiliation had been upgraded. Hargrove was reviewing charts in the hallway outside room for 12, his white coat pristine, his stethoscope draped across his shoulders like the insignia of command. He didn't acknowledge Rachel's approach until she was exactly 3 feet away. Then he deliberately released the patient file in his hands and let it fall to the floor, the paper scattering across the linoleum like feathers from something that had just been shot out of the sky. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice pitched to Carrie. A resident was visible at the far end of the corridor, pretending not to listen. "I need it filed before you scurry back to whatever hole you came from." Rachel looked at the scattered pages. Her vision had sharpened with the kind of tunnel focus that came from her brainstem, the ancient part of her brain that had been trained to recognize predatory behavior and measure response options. She could feel her hands wanting to shake. She didn't let them. She bent slowly, gathering the papers with exaggerated care, ordering them by page number rather than the order they fell. It took 43 seconds. She counted every one. When she straightened to her full height, all 5'9" of it, she found herself looking directly into Hargrove's eyes from a position of exact equality. "I've picked up heavier things than your ego, Doctor." Her voice came out like still water, perfectly calm, perfectly level, with no inflection that could be weaponized against her later. Not angry. Not trembling. Not wounded. Just a statement of fact, delivered with the kind of precision that made the surgical resident at the end of the corridor actually stop moving. For just a moment, Hargrove's smile flickered. His jaw tightened. Then he turned toward the resident as if Rachel had already ceased to exist, and made another joke about temp staff competence that nobody laughed at. Rachel walked past him, filed the paperwork in the correct slot with the correct urgency, and clocked in for her afternoon shift as if her scrubs weren't still damp with soup. What they didn't know was that the worst part hadn't arrived yet. The emergency alert system activated at 2:02 p.m. The overhead speaker crackled with the exact tone that meant incoming trauma, not routine, not waiting, not someone stable enough to undergo standard triage. The phrase that followed was a military designation, code red trauma, critical casualty incoming, ETA for minutes. Rachel's hands moved toward the trauma bay before conscious thought could catch up. She was already pulling on a second pair of gloves when the ambulance doors burst through the emergency entrance with the kind of urgency that made the entire ER stand to attention. The patient was male, late 30s, with trauma patterns that told their own story in anatomical shorthand. Gunshot wounds. Multiple entries, the kind that suggested a sustained firefight rather than a single exchange. His combat fatigues were soaked with blood that had already dried to a rust color, and the paramedics' report came in rapid-fire bursts. Sergeant First Class Garrett Mills, indirect fire injury to abdomen and right femur, lost approximately 2 liters en route, responsive to commands but increasingly lethargic, blood pressure trending down. Indirect fire. That meant explosives. That meant shrapnel. That meant he had survived something that most people didn't survive, and was currently in the process of dying from blood loss in the middle of Sacred Heart's emergency department. Rachel was assigned to the surgical team because all the regular staff were locked into a multi-vehicle accident on I-25. Hargrove wasn't even in the hospital. This was her skill set now, whether anyone knew it or not. She moved into the operating theater with the kind of fluid precision that comes from repetition under pressure, the exact same movements she had performed in a field hospital in Helmand Province 12 years ago, just translated into American medical equipment. The surgical team was strong, Dr. Patricia Chen handling the primary, 2 residents, a perfusionist standing by. Rachel's job was retraction and suction, keeping the surgical field clear so Chen could assess the extent of vascular damage. But when the femoral bleeding started escalating faster than the vascular surgeon, still scrubbing in, could manage, Rachel made a decision that existed in the space between civilian protocol and military necessity. She modified a tourniquet using the precise windlass technique that Navy corpsmen were taught in the forward operating bases of Kandahar and Fallujah, a technique that wasn't in any civilian training curriculum. Her hands moved on their own, tightening the tourniquet with exactly the right pressure, enough to stop the bleeding without compromising tissue perfusion. The femoral bleeding stopped like someone had turned off a valve. Dr. Chen didn't even look up. Good work. Buying us time. But someone else did look up. A man in a hospital security uniform, standing by the door to secure the room per protocol for military casualties. He was somewhere in his 50s, with the kind of weathered face and calloused hands that came from actual military service. His name tag said Davis. He froze mid-step, and his eyes locked onto Rachel's hands as she tightened the final knot. She saw the recognition happen. It moved through his face like a shock wave through water, the moment when pattern recognition became certainty. His eyes narrowed. He watched the rest of her movements with the intensity of someone trying to solve a problem that had just been handed to him. The surgery took 94 minutes. By the end, Sergeant First Class Garrett Mills was stable enough to be moved to recovery. 4 units of O-negative blood had been transfused, the same rare type that required a perfect donor match, the same type Rachel had donated during the staff drive 2 weeks earlier. The blood bank coordinator mentioned it to the surgical team as if it were just a coincidence, just a statistic. Rachel knew better. That evening, in the concrete silence of the parking garage, Davis found her as she was reaching for her car keys. He was alone, his security uniform already changed out for regular clothes, and his voice when he spoke was quiet enough that it wouldn't carry. "That tourniquet placement in there," he said. "I served with corpsmen in Fallujah. Sanjin Valley, mostly. Where'd you learn to tie like that?" Rachel's vision sharpened again, that same predatory focus, but this time it was accompanied by something else. The feeling of a door that had been closed for 12 years rattling in its frame. She could feel her hands wanting to betray her, could feel the precise muscle memory of that moment, the desert heat, the sound of small arms fire, the weight of someone else's life in her hands. She shook her head once. She didn't answer. She walked to the bus stop without looking back, leaving Davis standing alone under the fluorescent lights of the parking garage, the look on his face exactly like the look on a man's face when he's just realized that something impossible is actually real. The monitor started screaming at 2:38 in the morning. Rachel was running vitals on the 3rd floor when the ICU alarm erupted, that particular frequency that made your spine recognize something primal, something broken. She moved before the overhead page finished crackling. Garrett Mills' room. The same Special Forces sergeant whose chest she'd opened in surgery 36 hours earlier, whose lungs she'd reinflated with hands that remembered every field procedure from Marjah like muscle memory carved into bone. She hit the ICU at a controlled run. The night shift nurse, Trevor, stood frozen at the monitors, watching the pressure drop in real time. 62/38. Falling. Falling. What happened? Rachel didn't raise her voice. Quiet authority. The kind that comes from having made decisions under fire. He was stable. Sleeping. Then his SATS started drifting. Then this. Trevor gestured at the monitor like it had betrayed him. The ECG showed electrical alternans, the QRS complex shifting its amplitude with each heartbeat, a signature pattern that meant only one thing. Fluid around the heart. The pericardium filling. Compression. Cardiac tamponade. Rachel's hands were already moving, already pulling the ultrasound machine to bedside. 23 years of Navy training doesn't hesitate. It doesn't ask permission. It recognizes the math, 5 minutes before irreversible brain damage, maybe less with a pressure that low. The ultrasound showed it immediately, a dark pocket of fluid surrounding the right atrium, thickened and dark. Blood. A missed pericardial injury from the initial gunshot wound. 48 hours of bleeding into a closed space. Call Patel. Tell him ETA. She was already opening the pericardiocentesis kit, her fingers moving through the steps like muscle memory. Says 20 minutes. Traffic from his house in Lakewood. 20 minutes. Garrett had 5 at best. Rachel prepped the subxiphoid area with chlorhexidine, her movements economical and precise. The needle was an 18 gauge, long enough to reach the fluid pocket. She could feel the eyes on her, Trevor watching like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing, nurses gathering in the doorway because a temp nurse doesn't do this, because this was beyond scope, because the protocol was to wait. The protocol was also to let a 34-year-old man's brain die of hypoxia. Rachel's jaw clenched once. Just once. Then it loosened. She inserted the needle at a 45-degree angle toward the left shoulder, the ECG monitor taped to the needle hub so she could watch the cardiac tracing change as the needle tip approached the heart muscle. This was the precision that separated survival from catastrophe. 1 millimeter too deep and the needle perforated the right ventricle. 1 millimeter too shallow and she missed the fluid pocket entirely. The ECG shifted. ST elevation. She was close. Advancing, she said, the word more to herself than anyone else. The needle glided through the fibrous pericardium with a subtle change in resistance, like passing through a membrane, which it was. She advanced it another ½ centimeter and began aspirating. Blood came back. Dark, already clotting. She pulled 60 milliliters into the syringe, steady pressure, steady hand. The monitor showed the pressure beginning to climb. 68/42. 74/48. 88/55. By the time she'd aspirated the final 15 milliliters, Garrett's pressure had climbed to 102/62. His oxygen saturation rose from 86 to 94. His eyes moved beneath closed lids. His fingers twitched on the sheet. The needle came out. The syringe went into the biohazard waste. Rachel's hands lowered to her sides, and that was when she heard the breathing stop behind her, the moment Dr. Hargrove's presence registered in the doorway like a change in air pressure. He stood there in his pressed shirt at 2:50 in the morning, laptop bag over his shoulder from whatever research he'd been perfecting in his office, and his face cycled through expressions like a man watching a building collapse. First shock. Then something darker. Calculation. What did you just do? His voice came out thin, stretched. Rachel didn't turn around. She was documenting the procedure in the chart, her handwriting precise as a technical drawing. Procedure time, amount of fluid, vital sign response. She didn't answer because the answer was obvious. She'd just saved a man's life using a procedure that required knowledge Hargrove assumed she didn't have, using hands that moved with the kind of confidence that came from having done it before. Many times. In worse conditions. Under fire. Rachel. Not a question this time. A demand wrapped in a name. She turned slowly, marker still in her hand, and looked at him with eyes that had watched people die and learned to be still anyway. He had 5 minutes, doctor. The pressure was 60/38. Fluid in the pericardium. You performed an invasive procedure. You're a temporary nurse. He would have coded. Brain damage within minutes. She set the marker down with a sound like finality. I did what the situation required. Trevor and the 2 nurses in the doorway made themselves small. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm, the sound of survival, the sound of a choice made and lived with. Hargrove's lips tightened into something that wasn't quite a smile. He pulled out his phone and stepped into the hallway, already dialing, already whispering to whoever answered at 2:53 in the morning. She caught fragments. Practicing beyond scope. Liability exposure. Investigation. By the time Dr. Patel arrived 14 minutes later, his hair still showing pillow creases, his jacket buttoned wrong, Hargrove was waiting in the hallway with a narrative already assembled. Rachel watched him speak to Patel, watched his gestures point back toward her, watched Patel's expression shift from relief that the patient was alive to something more complicated and careful. She'd seen that expression in a lot of places. It was the look of a good man caught between doing what was right and protecting himself. She knew that calculus. She'd made similar trades in Marjah. The next morning, she was summoned to the chief nursing officer's office on the 4th floor, where a woman named Susan with kind eyes and exhausted shoulders delivered the suspension with the kind of gentleness that made it worse somehow. Pending investigation of scope of practice violations. It's precautionary. We know what you did. We know why. But there have to be protocols. Rachel listened without interrupting. Without defending. Without the tremor that sits behind a person's ribs when everything they've hidden about themselves is suddenly visible. She didn't tremble. She didn't argue. She nodded and accepted the envelope with her temporary credential badge inside and walked out of the hospital at 8:38 in the morning, 3 days into her cover story and already exposed. The parking garage was concrete and echoing. Her footsteps sounded like someone else's, clipped, precise, military. A woman who'd trained too long in places where hesitation was death. She didn't cry in the parking garage. She walked to her car with her credentials in her hand and her composure intact, the same composure that had held steady in a surgical theater 60 feet away from Taliban positions in Helmand province, the same composure that had guided a needle into a dying man's chest at 2:48 in the morning. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing exactly what Hargrove would do next. The worst part was recognizing the calculation in his eyes, the same calculation she'd seen in every ambitious person who suddenly realized they had leverage over a secret. He would build a case. He would call her references at the staffing agency and find the slight variations in her background, the deliberate gaps she'd inserted to keep herself invisible. He would activate his network, the donors, the board members, the people who owed him favors or feared his influence. He would weaponize this moment like it was the only weapon he'd ever needed. Rachel sat in her car in the Sacred Heart parking lot and watched the morning traffic on Colorado Boulevard blur past. Her phone sat on the passenger seat, silent and dark. No messages from her family. No calls from the Navy. No one knew where she was, which was exactly how she'd wanted it. The invisibility had been the entire point. Temp work meant no one could trace her. No one could pull her back. No one could ask her to be that person again, the one whose hands had held people together in places where the world was breaking apart. Except her hands had just held someone together. Across a needle. In a hospital in Denver. And now the whole architecture of her disappearance was about to come down. She started the car and drove home to her apartment on the edges of Capitol Hill, where she lived with almost no furniture and no photographs and a pair of boots in a closet that she'd promised herself she'd never need to touch again. Hargrove didn't wait for the investigation to begin before he made his calls. By 7 that evening, while Rachel was still collecting the last of her belongings from her locker, he was sitting in his office with the hospital's chief of surgery on speakerphone, his voice dropping into the register he used for serious men discussing serious consequences. The mahogany desk in front of him held 3 printed pages, the incident report, his own notes, and a copy of Rachel's temporary staffing contract with a section highlighted in yellow. He explained the legal liability. He said the words scope of practice. He mentioned a malpractice suit waiting to happen, a hospital reputation at stake, a temp agency that had clearly failed to vet their placements. He didn't say her name once. He didn't have to. The phone line crackled. The chief of surgery, whose research foundation had received $47,000 from Hargrove's connections in the last fiscal year, listened. And then he said he would call the administrator. Then he hung up. By 8 o'clock, Hargrove was dialing the staffing agency director in Aurora, his voice smooth as oil sliding over water. He left a voicemail. He mentioned the procedure Rachel had performed. He raised questions about credential verification. He suggested, with the precision of a surgeon making an incision, that someone should examine her background check more carefully. Had they verified her nursing license thoroughly? Had anyone called her references? What if the credentials were incomplete or, worse, fabricated entirely? It was just a thought. A concern. The kind of concern that could trigger an audit. He hung up and allowed himself a small smile. The smile of a man who understood institutional power the way other men understood breathing. 3 board members. 2 administrators. 1 staffing agency. A web constructed not from malice but from obligation and favor, the architecture that held hierarchies in place. It was elegant. It was efficient. It was unstoppable. Rachel stood in the break room at 8:02 p.m., holding a cardboard box that had once contained printer paper. Her locker was empty now. The cracked coffee mug with its faded "World's Okayest Nurse" inscription sat at the bottom of the box, nestled against a dying succulent with brown-edged leaves that she'd kept on the corner of her locker for 3 months without once remembering to water it. On top of both lay a photograph in a plastic sleeve, corners worn soft from handling. It was her platoon from Marjah. 23 faces. 9 of them circled in marker from a memorial service she never attended. Her name badge hung from her neck, she'd have to surrender it at HR. The plastic was cracked along the bottom edge from where she'd sat on it once during a long shift, and her photo was slightly faded, her expression carefully neutral, her eyes the color of someone who had taught themselves to be invisible. The certified letter had arrived that afternoon, delivered by courier with a signature requirement. Formal complaint filed by Dr. Hargrove regarding unlicensed practice. Immediate suspension pending investigation by external medical board investigator. 30 minutes to collect personal items. No further shifts scheduled. No contact with patients pending resolution. The language was bureaucratic and surgical and absolute. She'd cleaned out her locker in silence, moving through the hallway at shift change when half the staff was in the break room and nobody had to witness the ritual of her disappearance. One of the techs, a guy named Marcus who'd worked 3 shifts with her, had asked if she was okay. She'd said, "Fine. Just done." Which was almost true. which was the kind of answer that closed doors and prevented follow-up questions. Now she stood at the bus stop on East 17th Avenue waiting for the 39 heading downtown. The rain had started during her walk from Sacred Heart, the kind of October rain that fell in sheets and made the streetlights blur into halos. Her scrubs were soaked through. The cardboard box was getting soft along the bottom edges, starting to sag. She held it against her chest like it mattered, like these three objects, the mug, the plant, the photograph, constituted the sum of a life she'd been trying to leave behind. Headlights passed. Cars hissed through the wet street, their tires throwing up spray. A lift slowed down, the driver checking his phone, then accelerating again. She was not his destination. She was nobody's destination anymore. She was a woman in wet scrubs standing in the rain holding a disintegrating box, and the world moved past her without friction or consequence. She thought about the boots in her closet. The leather was cracked now, the laces frayed at the ends. She'd bought them new in 2008 at Fort Benicia, 22 years old, still stupid about what the boots meant, still believing that putting them on made you part of something larger than yourself. They'd walked through Marjah. They'd crossed the Arghandab River in August when the water was high enough to knock you off your feet. They'd stood in an OR in Denver 3 days ago while she performed a procedure that had saved a man's life and destroyed her own. The thing nobody told you about leaving a life like that was how thorough the leaving had to be. It wasn't enough to hang up a uniform or change your name on a civilian application. You had to become someone small. Someone quiet. Someone who wouldn't attract attention or recognition or the kind of notice that made people ask questions about who you used to be. She'd done that perfectly. She'd become exactly nobody. And now, standing at a bus stop in the rain with her locker's contents dissolving in her hands, she wondered if she'd achieved the only thing she was actually good at, erasing herself so completely that nothing remained. The bus pulled up. The doors hissed open with a sound like tired breathing. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed, casting everyone in a color like death. She could see her reflection in the door's window, a wet silhouette holding a box that was falling apart. Behind that reflection was another woman, a younger version, standing in desert sun instead of rain, wearing a rank on her collar and the kind of certainty that comes from knowing exactly what you're supposed to do. She lifted the box higher, ready to board, ready to move toward whatever came next. The apartment on Capitol Hill was waiting. The closet was waiting. The boots were waiting. And tomorrow would come like every other day had come in the past 18 months, quietly, without fanfare or recognition, a day where nobody knew her name and nobody cared if she disappeared. The bus doors began to close. Rachel moved toward them, and that's when the phone in her scrub pocket vibrated. Just once. A text notification. She almost ignored it. Almost stepped on the bus and let whatever message it was dissolve into the night like everything else was dissolving. But muscle memory, the kind that came from 18 months of being a person who couldn't afford to miss a single call, made her pause. The message came from Sacred Heart Hospital's main number. Ms. Torres, you are needed for an emergency consultation in ICU. Please call back immediately. Administrator. She stood between the closing doors. The bus driver was watching her in the mirror, waiting for her to commit. In or out? Destination or departure? Rachel Torres turned away from the bus. The doors hissed shut behind her. She pulled up the hospital number and dialed, and on the third ring, a voice she didn't recognize said, Ms. Torres, thank God. Sergeant Mills has regained consciousness. We need you back here now. There are people here who need to see you. Back at Sacred Heart, in his office with the door closed, Dr. Hargrove received an email confirmation from the external investigator. The investigation had been approved. The preliminary findings would be submitted within 7 days. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded across his chest, and allowed himself to close his eyes for just a moment. The silence was the silence of a man who had moved the pieces correctly, activated the mechanisms of institutional power, and set them in motion toward an outcome he could already see. In 7 days, Rachel Torres would be gone. The board would approve her termination. The staffing agency would blacklist her. And Sacred Heart Hospital would be the kind of place where temporary nurses understood their place, where ambitious moves were punished, where the hierarchy remained unquestioned. He opened his eyes and looked at the framed photograph on his desk, him in his white coat, standing beside the hospital's chief administrator, both of them smiling. This was power. This was how you maintained it. Not through cruelty, but through competence. Through understanding the network of favors and obligations. Through knowing which calls to make and in what order. He had no idea that Garrett Mills was awake. He had no idea about the visitor in the dark suit waiting in the hospital's administrative hallway with a badge that bore no name, only a seal. He had no idea that the protocol for classified military operations had just been activated, that security was being established on the 4th floor, that a 2-star admiral was currently en route to Sacred Heart with a detail of 6 personnel. He was still smiling when his office phone rang. The hospital administrator, her voice formal and strange, "Dr. Hargrove, we need you in the ICU. Admiral Mills has arrived, and there's a situation with the detainee from the raid. You need to come now. It's about the temp nurse you filed the complaint about. 3 days." That's how long Garrett Mills hung suspended between the living and the dead before his eyes opened in ICU 4, the ventilator tube still threaded down his throat, monitors beeping their mechanical hymn around him like prayers. The blinds were drawn against the Denver morning light. But what happened next didn't just change the room, it ended careers. An armed security detail entered with a man in a navy dress uniform, 2 stars pinned to his collar catching the fluorescent glow. Admiral Daniel Mills. Garrett's older brother. His presence made the air pressure change, as if the room itself had to accommodate someone accustomed to commanding thousands. But it wasn't the admiral who broke the silence. It was the detainee wheeled in under guard, hands restrained, eyes covered with a black cloth, a translator standing 6 feet away with a tablet loaded with digital protocols. The blindfold came off. The moment the fabric dropped, the detainee's entire body went rigid. His eyes fixed on Rachel standing near the medication cart, and his mouth opened, and the words came tumbling out in Pashto first, rapid fire, his voice cracking with something that might have been fear or gratitude, the two emotions sometimes indistinguishable in the aftermath of survival. Then he switched to broken English, his accent thick as dust. You are the devil medic from Marjah. The one who saved the children. The ones under the rubble. You carried them out yourself. His restrained hand shook. I knew your face. I see it still when I sleep. Rachel's hand froze on the medication tray. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like cicadas. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. In the corner, a cardiac monitor beeped its steady rhythm, the only sound that felt real. Garrett's 12-year-old daughter Emma stood near the doorway, having slipped past protocol because her father had whispered her name when consciousness first flickered back behind his eyes. She was supposed to be in the waiting room. She was supposed to be drinking juice from a plastic cup and coloring in a pad. Instead, she watched Rachel's face, and then she looked at her father, and then she looked at the woman she'd known as the quiet nurse from the temp agency that her father had mentioned once, twice, 100 times during his fevered dreams. You're a senior chief petty officer, Emma whispered. Not a question. A fact she'd assembled from her father's delirious rambling over 72 hours of morphine and blood loss and the kind of trauma that cracks men open and spills their truest memories onto hospital sheets. Daddy told me. He said you saved for Marines. He said you dragged them through a minefield. He said. But Rachel was already moving. Not toward Emma. Toward the chart hanging on the bedside table. Her eye scanned the medical history, the admission notes, and then she found it. The reference section. Page 8. A field report dated 2012, classified redaction marks pixelating half the page, but her own name there in the document, not Rachel Torres but the rank preceding it. The unit designation. The operation. The footnote that referenced her name in connection with a civilian casualty intervention in Marjah, Helmand Province, where she had performed emergency medicine in a compound surrounded by rubble, where she had treated children, where she had chosen to save first and ask authorization never. Her hands moved to her sides. Her breathing didn't change. The Admiral stepped forward, his dress uniform a forest of ribbons, 3 rows of them, each one a story, each one a calculated decision made under fire. But he wasn't looking at his brother. He was looking at Rachel. And then, from the security detail behind him, a man in civilian clothes stepped forward, a former SEAL commander with a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw like a lightning strike, and he had served with Rachel in a unit she no longer allowed herself to name. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain outside, hammering the windows like applause. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, the commander said. His voice didn't boom. It was steady, precise, the voice of someone accustomed to being heard in silence. Bronze Star with Valor. He paused. 1 beat. 2. 3. The words hung in the air like a salute. Purple Heart. Another pause. The weight accumulated. Navy Commendation Medal. He looked directly at her, and his eyes were the color of a stormy Atlantic, and she could see her own reflection in them, a woman who had been drowning and was only now remembering how to surface. A Navy Cross for dragging for Marines through a minefield under sniper fire while carrying a 5-year-old girl who had shrapnel embedded in both legs. Emma's hand covered her mouth. Dr. Hargrove stood near the doorway, still in his white coat, and his face had gone the color of old bone. All the certainty draining. All the strategic competence crumbling like chalk. "There's more," said a woman in a charcoal suit who had entered quietly behind the Admiral. Pentagon liaison. ID badge stating classified authorization. She held a folder that was clearly marked restricted. Senior Chief Torres participated in Operation Nightingale, a classified medical intervention at 3 forward operating bases in Helmand Province. Her work resulted in the treatment and evacuation of 200 civilian casualties, 47 of them children under 10. Her decisions under fire were audited at the highest levels and found to be not only medically sound but strategically essential to maintaining community cooperation with coalition forces. Rachel looked down at her hands. The same hands that had held scalpels. The same hands that had torn open field kits and performed procedures that existed in that grey space between training and necessity, between what the manual said and what the moment demanded. Her trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind of restraint that comes from understanding that she was finally, after 2 years of hiding, permitted to stop running. "I want to know who suspended this woman," the Admiral said. Not a request. A command. His voice like a tank idling in a garage, quiet, but containing enough horsepower to level everything around it. He turned to the administrator who had entered with the security detail, the one whose job description included saying yes to things like investigations and suspension protocols. Dr. Hargrove filed the complaint, the administrator stammered. His hands were moving, small nervous gestures, like he was trying to reshape the air itself. "We followed procedure." "The investigation." "I don't care about procedure," the Admiral said. "I care about whether a decorated senior enlisted medical professional was punished for doing exactly what she was trained to do and what she knew was necessary." Was she? The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the administrator nodded, and that nod was a confession. Within 30 minutes, the main lobby of Sacred Heart was assembled like a stage set for a reckoning. The hospital CEO in a grey suit that cost more than a car payment. The board chair with her reading glasses on a beaded chain. The chief medical officer who suddenly looked 10 years older. And Dr. Hargrove, whose expression had shifted from arrogant to cornered to the particular panic of a man watching his institutional power evaporate like water on a griddle. A local news crew, filming a human interest piece on pediatric cancer recovery, had gotten wind of the commotion and set up cameras near the information desk. Nurses began drifting toward the lobby, drawn by the static crackle of walkie-talkies and the smell of something momentous about to happen. Residents emerged from the halls. Staff gathered in clusters, their eyes moving from Dr. Hargrove to the Admiral in his dress blues, the ribbons on his chest like a visual history of command. Admiral Mills stood with his feet spread in a stance that had probably held him steady on a destroyer bridge during rough seas, and he addressed the crowd, not just the hospital administration, but every person in that lobby, including the cameras rolling to capture it for the evening broadcast. This hospital suspended a decorated Navy senior chief petty officer for performing a life-saving procedure that she was trained to do under fire in combat zones. "The man she saved is my brother." He pointed to Dr. Hargrove. This doctor's ego nearly killed a Special Forces operator. His retaliation against the woman who saved that operator is a disgrace to the medical profession and to the oath every one of you took when you entered this field. Dr. Hargrove opened his mouth. No sound emerged. He tried again. "I was following protocol." "The scope of?" "I'm not interested in your protocols," the Admiral said. "I'm interested in your termination. I am formally requesting your immediate removal from this hospital's staff and the revocation of your clinical privileges." The CEO's eyes went to the cameras, then to the gathered staff, then to the Admiral. The calculation took for seconds. "Dr. Hargrove's employment is terminated, effective immediately," the CEO announced. "We will be conducting a comprehensive review of his conduct and implementing new oversight protocols for credentialing and staff treatment." Hargrove's protests died in his throat. They actually died, you could see it, the moment his voice stopped working, his mouth opening and closing like a fish removed from water. Security moved toward him with the kind of professional courtesy reserved for people who need to leave but still deserve their dignity preserved for legal purposes. Rachel stood in the corner of the lobby, still in her civilian clothes because she had come straight from home, from the coffee shop where the barista knew her name, from the life she had thought she was building in the wreckage of her old one. Tears streamed down her face. Not from shame. From recognition. From the collision of her two selves, finally permitted to occupy the same space. Davis, the security contractor who had recognized her techniques in the OR 3 days ago, stepped forward in his tan uniform and rendered a salute, a closed fist over his heart, held for 3 long seconds, the kind of salute that said, "I know what you did. I was there. Welcome home." 6 months later, someone would spot Dr. Marcus Hargrove selling supplemental insurance policies from a folding table outside a King Soopers grocery store in a Denver suburb, his medical license revoked by the state board, his career excavated down to its foundations and found to contain a pattern of retaliation, cruelty, and abuse spanning the entire duration of his tenure at Sacred Heart. His expensive car had been replaced by a 10-year-old sedan. His certainty had been replaced by the particular exhaustion of a man who understood, finally, that competence alone does not guarantee immunity from consequences. But that was later. That was the aftermath. What mattered now was the Veterans Day ceremony held 6 months forward, in the main atrium of Sacred Heart Hospital, where the hospital's CEO and board members sat in the front row, where staff who had once watched Rachel's humiliation with the kind of complicit silence that is its own form of violence now stood applauding. Rachel stood in dress blues, her uniform tailored with a precision that only comes from wearing one for decades, from understanding that a uniform is not costume but statement. Her rank insignia on the collar. Her ribbons across her chest. Her movements carrying the kind of weight that comes from actual authority, not assumed authority, actual command born from experience under fire. The shadow box mounted on the wall behind the podium contained her worn combat boots, the leather cracked and stained with desert dust, preserved under glass alongside her Navy Cross citation and a photograph of her platoon from Marjah, faces frozen in time, half of them now gone, all of them now remembered in a hospital in Denver in a way that meant something beyond just survival. "I spent years believing I had to hide who I was to find peace," Rachel said. Her voice had changed. It had dropped an octave, had acquired the kind of steadiness that comes from having made life or death decisions and living to defend them. "I learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting, and service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior." Garrett Mills sat in the third row with his daughter Emma, who was no longer surprised by her father's hero worship because she had finally understood that heroes sometimes walked quietly through hallways in scrubs. The Admiral sat beside them, and Davis the security contractor stood in the back in his own Navy dress uniform, finally revealed, finally entitled to wear it in public after years of private service. Rachel's hands no longer trembled when she spoke. Her eyes no longer carried the weight of secrets. She now served as Sacred Heart's Director of Emergency Medicine, appointed personally by the board, her authority no longer hidden but written into her title, her rank, her badge. The camera in the hospital's promotional footage panned to the shadow box containing her boots, then to the faces of the staff applauding, then to Rachel's face, no longer haunted, no longer hiding, finally whole. Please subscribe to our channel to never miss a story of hidden strength and earned recognition. Like this video if you believe the quiet ones often carry the heaviest burdens. And comment below, have you ever been misjudged by someone who didn't know your true background? Your story might inspire someone today.